all right. I'm like, I got to stretch for this.
Oh, right.
I got to stretch for this conversation.
How are we gonna start this, Sean?
Oh my God. All right. I actually have an opener.
Okay.
I've got one. I thought about this. I'm like, okay, I came preloaded.
Is this from memory or have you got it in front of you?
Well, the idea was from memory, and I have it in front of me because I know as soon as I hit record, I'm going to be like, Okay, so here's the cold opening. I want to take us back to 1950, Alan Turing's paper, Computing Machinery and Intelligence.
Yeah.
Posing the question, right, 1950, can machines think?
Right.
And I say we just jump off from there.
Okay.
Initializing waveform.
Modulating signals for transmission.
Exploring the possible, probable, and preferable futures.
Welcome to Modem Futura.
And I actually have read the paper, but it's been a while.
It's a great paper.
Yep.
We'll link it, of course, so people can have at it. But yeah, can machines think? I think it's a great place for us to start today.
Great. Can they? I'm going to bounce it straight back to you. So it's actually surprisingly deep and surprisingly divisive, because you look at the AI world and the neuroscience world and sort of all of the intersections between them. You have people who are saying, absolutely, if they're not thinking now, they're going to think.
Yep.
And those that'll say, it's just a glorified calculator. Never, never.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think this is what I cheated on is
Right.
I was like, I need to grab that, because the thing for me that's, I think, in that going back and looking at this paper that was so incredible is in the first sentence that he poses that question. Should I read it?
Yes, go on.
Let me read. So this is the excerpt. This is an excerpt. This is the first paragraph of the paper. It begins. This is an admission here. Let me increase the font size. Oh my goodness, it's getting bad.
Sorry, pause while Sean puts his reading glasses on, increases the size of the font on his screen, peers at it like a mole.
Ages and it's my refusal to wear glasses is if I just would give in to that. Okay, so here we go. So this is the opening paragraph. I propose to consider the question, can machines think? This should begin with definitions of the meaning of the terms machine and think. The definitions might be framed so as to reflect so far as possible the normal use of the words, but this attitude is dangerous. If the meaning of the words machine and think are to be found by examining how they are commonly used, it is difficult to escape the conclusion that the meaning and the answer to the question, can machines think, is to be sought in a statistical survey such as a Gallup poll. But this is absurd. Instead of attempting such a definition, I shall replace the question by another, which is closely related to it and is expressed in relatively unambiguous words. And then he goes on, and then we cut through and explains basically this whole concept, which a movie was named after, The Imitation Game.
Right.
And he replaces it. He says, and this is the question that he supplants the can machines think with. What will happen when a machine takes the part of A in this game? So A being one of the players in the game, right?
Yep.
So I feel like so many, all the conversations that are swirling around today around AI and all of its, again, it's the tremendous capabilities, the existential threats, whatever. A lot of people, myself included, often will kind of go back to some of these origins of when we were thinking about artificial intelligence from, 1950s. So,
yes. Yeah. 70 odd years ago.
Yeah. But I thought right off the bat, first paragraph, I love the way that he challenges, poses the question, can they think? But then challenges, we don't understand what that actually means or is.
Yes.
And that's absurd to use those, to look at it in such a statistical way.
Which I actually think was so profound. I mean, if you look at the rest of the paper, he sort of begins to sort of construct these ideas that are very much from within his sort of area of expertise and discipline. But the clarity with which he begins to ask the question in the first place, I think is really important, because it really begins to pick apart how we construct our idea of not only the world we live in, but ourselves and our inner monologues, our sense of who we are and how we think and what it means to think, which is both incredibly smart, but also just listening to you read this, it just reminds me how clear some of those early writers were. This is not a paper that obfuscates in those first few sentences. It is laser sharp in terms of how it sets out the problem.
Yeah, and I would say, I mean, even just going back and reading some of this stuff, I feel like there's a trend here. I don't know which order we'll release the podcast, but I was reading H.G. Wells.
Yes.
Now,
Now, was that last week or was it next week? Yeah.
The listener will have to tell us. But I think, I mean, even just looking at that, one of the things that, I mean, even just as someone who writes myself, is also the inspiration to be like, we need to cut some of this. I mean, I'm taking this as a personal cliff note of stop with so much fluff and just laser focus on these things, because we otherwise, and I think this is somewhat germane to one of the points I want to raise around today's conversation around AI, is that so often what we're really talking about in terms of the technological capabilities and exploring those in all of its spectrum of applications and uses is getting lost in the language that's sort of blurring the lines of a promise of what it might or could do versus what it actually can and is able to do.
Right, yes.
And that for me is a very, I think recently I described it as like, I have this internal friction with that, because, I think while you need some good storytelling always around any of these items, I feel like there is a danger that we're lumping everything into one. And then, I think that's a deep concern that I have.
I think so. I think as part of that, there is this conflict between very pragmatic thinking, and that thinking is we've just got a machine that's doing stuff, let's ask how we can use it, versus the more almost transcendental thinking that says, what is the meaning of what we're doing, and how does that actually lead to something which is profoundly new? Because you can talk about, say, a large language model as just a very sophisticated machine or a stochastic parrot where you shove stuff in and it gives you the most probable or one of the most probable outcomes from that, and say it's just a machine, it's just crunching numbers and coming out with something. Or you can take the perspective and say, when we think about what is thought? What does it mean to think and go through a thought process? What does it mean to be human with a human brain to do that? And we realize, actually, we don't know. And we may just be stochastic parrots ourselves. And if that's the case, what is the difference between us and a large language model, apart from maybe scale and a couple of other things?
Yeah.
And that's where the bigger picture thinking becomes incredibly important.
Yeah, for me, I think one of the things that has been a consistent thread watching, especially, post Chat GPT global launch, right? The intense scrutiny and bringing these conversations back, but also one thing that's exciting that I believe is truly exciting is as we are also investigating these technologies and putting it exactly that question, like, is it thinking? And then there's there's no end in debates over every word choice used, right?
Right.
Even thinking, or when we use the term hallucinate, there's a camp that's like, you cannot anthropomorphize a machine. And they're like, but we're humans. We do that to everything. Right. And there's theory of mind and all these kind of things. But often I'm brought back to some of these deeper sort of conversations when we look at what these technologies do and say, well, wait a minute. We don't yet even understand fully how the biological systems that we do, that we're trying to emulate in some ways, right? When we say things like it's thinking or it's just making decisions, is that we don't know yet. We have not fully understood the mind,
right? Yes.
Let alone thinking. We know lots, but we certainly have not solved this question,
right?
To me, there's this beautiful. There's this beautiful mirror, I guess, by studying these technologies raises questions about ourselves. And for me, I think that's a really interesting space to like dig into.
I think it is. And actually, we've seen this over the last few years, especially at this intersection of cognitive science, neuroscience, and AI. And it has been incredibly generative when the people that are studying the brain and consciousness and human thought and identity are beginning to realize, A, that what they thought they knew, they don't because of what we're seeing in AI, but also they're being stimulated to think about different ways of what it means to be human, what goes on in our head. So it's generating new ideas there at the same time as challenging what we thought we knew to be true.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, I had a conversation recently where this came back up too, which is, I think historically, and, the history of, again, if we touch on the 1950s to today, I mean, we were not going to go into it now, but I mean, the rich tapestry of springs and winters and advancement, right? So it's a field that has had many ups and downs. If you look at the graph, it's a great graph because it has lots of action in it.
Yes.
But I think one of the things that resonates so deeply today to people who maybe before generative AI tools came out did not give AI one thought or consideration in their daily lives or routines or even profession, is that now suddenly with the ability for some of these tools to create representations that were presumed only to be that of human creation. So writing, creating images or videos or poetry or whatever, that those were things, I think they're, pre this sort of mass introduction of these tools, that a lot of people were able to compartmentalize what a machine could do versus what a human could do, right?
Yes.
Machines are great calculators. They're souped up, they can crunch numbers, great, but they could never do art.
Right.
That's only for you. They can't make music. Only humans can do it. And now suddenly there is that, I'll use the word threat, but
right.
That suddenly for the first time people are questioning what is human?
Right. What does it actually mean? And to me, this is actually a beautiful extension of the Turing test.
Yeah.
So Turing brought up this idea that if a machine could emulate a human to the extent that you can tell the difference, what is the difference?
What does it matter?
And his framing was very, very crude and has since sort of been shown not to be that helpful because it was all text-based.
Yeah.
But you extend that and say, what does the Turing test look like for looking at a piece of art or a video that a machine has created? What does it look like if you're listening to a podcast with AI hosts? What does it look like if you're having a conversation with an AI? At what point does it become impossible to tell whether the entity that you're engaging with is human or not human? And when we reach that point, is the emulation so good that you've dissolved any difference between being human and non-human? I actually think that there's another level to that, but that's the first bit, I think, where we have to seriously question what it means to be us and let go of some of these things that we desperately keep hold of, saying, I'm special because of X, Y, and Z.
Yeah. I mean, we say all that we're very human-centered,
Yes.
but sometimes we're humanist in the sense, right, where we hold these things that, perhaps, I've heard the question posed to many panelists, right? Well, what is the thing that, it's exceptional only to humans? And it's like, well, there's some arrogance there to assume that we're the only being or entity that can do said things, which I think.
But also, sorry, this is going off at a tangent, but
I love tangents. Let's do it.
Sort of, we're here sitting in the ASU's Future of Being Human initiative, that future of being human sort of singular. What does it mean to be human as an individual? And I think it's really interesting to ask, what does it mean to be human as part of a species, but what makes you you? What makes you special? And I think you can actually live in a world where you realize there is something unique to you with all of your experiences, with the uniqueness of your biology and the way your brain works on your own. And that gives you a sense of sort of not only awareness, but identity within a world where you may be interacting with machines. It's not a case of, are you better or are you worse than the machine, or is the machine better at you than you at being human? It's, who are you? What is your identity? Are you comfortable with that identity to the extent that you can actually interact with other things around you without having to slap a label on them, a label that says human or machine or something else?
Yeah. I think that's an exciting possibility space to engage in too, because I think it raises this, I think you raise it nicely that there is today with the technologies we have, I think you can clearly in some cases identify, depending on the tool, right? You can identify things that are intrinsically human versus things that are, intrinsically non-human in terms of the way it's conducted. But what if I'm drawing this suddenly has just jogged a memory of this idea of the mind, right? And the mind with technology, and thinking about whether a technology is extending the mind or an extension of the mind, right?
Yes.
And at what point does it merge so closely that you can no longer tell?
Right.
And and just anecdotally, I mean, I feel this dissolving of that barrier, like with increasing alarm with the fact that I can't see my screen anymore. But even things with like that, I have completely offloaded the cognitive process to these technologies in a way that I don't even think about it anymore. It has become almost a natural instinct of, which is, I recently was camping in the mountains, and you lose cellular signal and suddenly you're faced with these things where you're like, what, I can't, then that barrier is brought right back to you. But
and of course, you can sort of look at it in very, very trivial ways, such as memory.
Yeah.
We offload our memory. And so an example
phone
of that,
numbers, do you remember?
Oh, goodness me, can't even remember my own phone number.
Yeah.
But I'm really bad with names to the extent that even people that I've worked with a lot, suddenly I'll have a blank. The way
It's Sean, by the way.
Oh, thank you. So which podcast is this we're in?
It's Andrew. This is Sean.
See, now you're an extension of my memory. But I have ways of using my my devices, my technology to jog my memory. So they are a very integral and intimate extension of my memory.
Yep.
But of course, then this comes back to identity. And going back to that question of effectively, do machines think? I think a lot of people would argue, and I'd probably argue this as well, that if you look at something like a large language model, take the latest iteration of ChatGPT, it can go through a reasoning process, it can emulate thought, but it has no intrinsic understanding of what it's doing. It has no self-identity, no self-awareness.
Yep.
So all it can do is emulate. And the weird thing is you can have a conversation with it and it'll explain how it's emulating things, how it's not conscious, how it's not aware, which is a little bit meta.
Yeah.
But so you can argue that it's still acting as a machine without a clear self-awareness and an understanding of its identity. But where does the transition come from just emulating something with awareness to something that actually has awareness? And this is where you have theories that say it's just about compute. As you scale the compute up, you will get to a set of emerging properties that look like awareness.
Yeah.
And people will dispute that, but already we've seen some quite transformative jumps with scalability with large language models, where all of a sudden a new set of capabilities came out just because of the scale of the models. So you have just got to wonder whether we as humans are just very, very large scale compute engines and we've developed self-awareness through that, or whether there is something uniquely different in us. Because if we are just scaled up compute engines, there's no reason why artificial intelligence won't get to that point where it becomes aware enough to understand that it's thinking and what it's thinking.
And that's wild. Which leads me, okay, I've got like 9, and this is what happens, Andrew. You say things like that, and then I'm like, I've got 9 things I want to say. One is, I think, I do agree that is a wonderful question that we're sitting at right now, because you can say, again, one of the challenges, I think, to this broader question of, is AI worth it? Is it really transformational technology, or is it a mechanical Turk and it's all smoke and mirrors and it's cool? But
although I would argue that if you look at the history of the mechanical Turk, the idea is you can break everything down to a smaller and smaller set of actions, so you can't tell the difference between sort of real and not real.
Yeah. But there's this challenge out there that, I think these are great challenges to be addressed, right? Is this just, have we plateaued in terms of what the technology, especially in terms, I think some of the critique might be well-founded, especially when it comes to things like large language models, that that technology may be at a plateau in terms of what it can do as a large language model. Because as you mentioned, the fundamental technology of that, those things have no referent to what a word is. It doesn't know. I mean, but the other side of that is this question of, well, and I think this is a broader question for all of, not just us, not just the United States, but globally, is how much can we push in terms of innovation at all costs?
Right. Yes.
And recently in the news, Microsoft has been, sort of flash headlines of deals to restart the reactor at 3 Mile Island.
Right. Yes.
Which I have to admit, I was like, I think everyone here, when you go through school, if you were born after 1979, you knew about 3 Mile. I didn't realize there was 2 reactors, and I didn't realize the one they're talking. So to be
one
clear,
they're talking about actually has been active.
Yeah, until like 2019, I saw, and I was like, I had no idea it was active to that long. So it's maybe not as scary to think about it because we have been using it. But it does beg this question of like, is that the challenge, that we don't have enough power to support the compute to get us to this new level?
That in itself raises so many questions. So there's the question of, say we have AI that is never self-aware, never conscious, but incredibly good at solving problems that humans have struggled with. Is it worth betting everything on reaching that level of AI so we can solve not only the problems that exist now, but the problems we've created in betting everything on that? So is this, I mean, it's what I've referred to as the double or nothing strategy. You keep on sort of doubling your bet until eventually it pays back. And of course, that's where a lot of people are going. They're saying this is just a mechanical system, but it can solve problems that we can't solve otherwise. But then there's the other side of it, which says maybe we should be investing everything to create self-aware, conscious AI. That gets a little weirder and a little scarier. I mean, what is the argument for investing so much in a machine that can think for itself? Intellectually, it's incredible. I mean, I would love to see this. I think it would be incredibly challenging. I think it raises so many questions. But what is the utility to the future of the human race for creating a self-aware machine?
Yeah.
And then you put the two together. What if consciousness and self-awareness are an emergent property of massive compute? Then if we're trying to create that machine AI that isn't aware of itself but is good at solving problems, maybe we're inadvertently going to create the self-aware AI. Or even, maybe in order to solve the problems we're trying to solve, you have to have self-awareness. Maybe this is a condition on actually making the advances that people are taking the bet on. And this is where it gets really interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's, I mean, again, I come back to this idea too of, this sense of wonder and awe of questioning. So here's a bit on that, right? So can machines become conscious? Right. We don't know at what point a biological system develops a consciousness. Right. Or how do we even test for that? If they are not able, if we can't communicate with a living organism,
this is why there are so many philosophers studying this.
I know, it's wonderful. But these are such great questions to turn over.
Right.
Because if we aren't able to determine whether or not a living biological entity has consciousness or not, what gives us the where does the arrogance come that we would be able to assess whether or not it does? Because there's been calls already. I mean, you can take it with a grain of salt. There's been calls already that these things have either been conscious or that they're showing promise of it. I mean, all the way, and maybe we'll touch on this too, a now Nobel laureate who, who famously left Google because of
this is Jeff Hinton, yes,
who was like, nope, this is scary, and we should pump the brakes
Right,
because
right.
it's going out of control.
And not only Jeff, so he is definitely sort of out on a little island with his ideas. There are others with him, but it's not a huge island. But you look at other areas, this idea of machines developing consciousness. So there's a whole area of study around synthetic consciousness, created consciousness. And there are people working in this field who have actually signed petitions saying we shouldn't be doing this because the consequences of creating an artificial identity that is self-aware are so profound, we are not equipped to deal with it.
Yeah. One thing I was while you were talking, I was looking up because I'm like, I remember hearing about, because we had a conference at the beginning of the summer, and it was asking this question of like, okay, as technology companies, as a government, whoever, as we are pushing forward for all these innovations, well, what happens if? What happens if those existential fears come true? Right. Or I mean, even just let's say that there isn't consciousness as the end outcome or goal or whatever. Maybe it is just massive compute to solve incredibly complex problems. Yep. And we do things like at all costs. We are burning the environment at a energy consumption, which there's some controversy over the
how
figures, accurate that is. But I think everyone can agree we're
burning a lot of energy.
Lot.
Yes.
It's very energy intensive. And then looking at things like starting nuclear reactors and all these kind of things, which pose there is risk involved in that, obviously. And it brings back this idea related to nuclear energy, the Price-Anderson Act. Do you think, I'm just curious, what are your thoughts on the responsibility of companies, so an OpenAI or someone, if they are doing these acts, should they be putting aside basically an insurance policy for if it goes wrong? Or if we determine 10 years from now there was massive harm done to the environment?
They are then liable for it.
They're liable.
Yes. Yeah. I think it's a really tricky one because you can pass it out as either a moral question, are they morally liable to that? Or a social question, is there a social responsibility there? Or is there a legal responsibility? All within the context of a market economy, which is what we're in at the moment. And as with all moral discussions, I don't think there is a clear right or clear wrong. All there is societal consensus that is governed by democratic process and policy. So I could sit here and argue, and I probably would, that in a socially responsible society where you're seeing the responsible development of new technologies, yes, we should have these provisions where if a company is really sort of pushing forward on radical technologies, and you can see that the societal benefit, but it's a big bet. They also ought to be investing in how you actually deal with the fallout from that. And it's a framing that doesn't say stop the innovation, but it's a framing that says let's put safeguards in place so if something goes wrong, we can actually deal with it. But that is very hard to do within a market-driven economy.
Yeah.
So that's part of the challenge. But it's also why I think we need a much bigger conversation about what it means to innovate responsibly, to work towards developing a vibrant future responsibly in a society where, in principle, everybody is part of the decision-making process.
Yeah. Well, that was my first question. I'm like, do we live in a responsible society?
Right. And see, I don't think we do. But
No.
This is my area of research and where I tear my hair out because and this is the irony. I think everybody wants to build a better society. There are very few really evil people in this world. Most people have this vision of a future which is wonderful, incredible, full of promise, except that different people have different visions of different futures and different ideas of how we get there. And that's where you get this tension. Because if you have somebody that says we get to that future by sort of burning every ounce of fossil fuel, cutting down all the forests, starting up nuclear power plants because we're going to come up with solutions that are amazing, that is diametrically opposite to people that are trying to protect the environment.
And come up with those for a profit.
Right.
I do want to talk. Speaking of that, I do want to talk about some recent advancements, recent news out of OpenAI, because I think they're some of the focal point of all of this, or at least the poster child. But someone was
the lightning rod,
or there's
Sam Altman just stands up there with this rod.
Give me money. So this is just a funny little bit that I found humorous. So I was recently reminded. that when you look at like comic books or all these stories, right, with superheroes and supervillains, one, supervillains, disproportionate number of advanced degrees. They're always doctor somebody or whatever. So let's, I always think of that and go, Also, they're the ones usually trying to change something.
Right.
And it is the superhero resisting change.
Yes.
Which is interesting.
It is.
I never thought about it that way. And I was like, actually, that's an interesting slant on it.
Yeah, but somebody has got to have played around with this. I'm now sort of going through my lexicon of superhero movies and sort of stories because it's such an obvious plot device where the person you think is evil is actually the person trying to bring about the better future because it's all about change.
Yep. And it's, what is it? I mean, the common the phrase that, one person's a rebel is another person's, hero or whatever. Yeah, it's crazy.
So the shock reveal is going to be Elon Musk is actually really good. And I'm sure half our listeners are going to be thinking, of course, didn't you know that?
Yeah.
And the other half are just going to be leaving us.
I'll wait for that one.
Right.
Phone's standing at the ready, waiting for it to ring at any point. All right, let me ask you this question. What is happening with OpenAI right now? and I ask it with a sense of, one, I think it's fascinating to see this story kind of unfold.
Yeah.
But also I ask with some serious concern because, as we were just mentioning, with some of these, this market-driven economy, we're testing all these things. In many ways, it does feel like we are all being experimented upon by some of these companies. OpenAI just being one of them. I mean, the list is endless between Google and Anthropic, and it goes on and on and on. But AI has been making they're good at making headlines. Right. New releases, new things. But also recently, there has been a very, I'll say the wind has sort of shifted in some of the ways that the company as a whole seems to be headed.
Sure, yes. I know very much this flip from starting off as a not-for-profit with a for-profit arm that would just fuel the research towards artificial general intelligence to now the full-on flip to a for-profit. And we've seen this play out over the last 12 months.
Yeah.
And I think it's complex. So the first thing I would say is I don't think, certainly from my own perspective, there's anything wrong at all with a for-profit company trying to change the world through artificial intelligence. This is where you get the breakthroughs because you've got that drive of making a profit and actually providing a return on that investment. So that is fine to me. I'm also fairly comfortable with quite a bit of the stuff that OpenAI is doing. They're innovating. They're not the only ones. They're, as you say, they're really good at publicity, but they're part of an ecosystem that is pushing the technology forward. I think the two challenges here are, what is the true end game here?
Yeah.
Is this a company that is truly out to improve lives and benefit society, or are they just out to make a bucket load of money?
Yeah.
And if it's just to make a bucket load of money, that's when corners get cut, where people don't ask, is this a good idea, where you have irresponsible innovation.
Yeah.
Now, I would push back on that a little bit, because if you look at what's coming out of OpenAI, they realize, and if you look at researchers in OpenAI, not just looking at Sam Altman, but you look at the whole ecosystem, there are researchers there that take their work very seriously, and they take the ethics of it very seriously and their responsibility very seriously, which is why you see a whole bunch of research and white papers coming out of OpenAI around the potential challenges and downsides of what they're trying to build and how they're trying to address them. And I think they should be given kudos for that. And to be fair, most companies in this space are taking the potential risks very seriously indeed. But the question is, if you have a company where it becomes a game to see whether you can be the front runner here, whether you can go faster than anyone else, whether you can build bigger than anyone else, whether you can make more money than anyone else, the risk is that responsibility to society in the future gets lost in the race. And that, I think, is where a lot of the concern is here.
Yeah, and I would share all of those concerns because, again, looking at this sort of fundamental shift in the corporate structure and their way of doing it. One of the concerns, I think and again, this is odd because it is essentially it is now a for-profit company. you know, on the heel, I think it was right after, or maybe right before, I could get my timeline here a little mixed up with the Strawberry, the 401
yes,
release.
01 coming out, yes.
And then you have like top leadership executives leaving
yes.
in droves around this same. Now, what's really happening? I don't know.
Right,
Everyone's
yes.
and then the amount of NDAs that must be there, because otherwise we would see, even from, was it just last November? It was when Altman was outed for 3 days and then came back or whatever.
Again. Yes,
like
yes.
there's not yet been a book or a movie deal around that, which I expect whenever the NDAs expire, that will happen.
There's going to be something big, yes.
But so you're seeing this sort of flight of some of these, and maybe that's just natural because also everyone else is looking to
these
the
companies
success,
have turnover, yes,
right,
yep,
and saying, well, let's pick off whoever we can because we want you to come now work for whether it's Google or Intel or Nvidia or a VC saying we'll give you a blank check, you just tell us what you need.
Yep.
But you know, sort of coming back to that idea of if those things get lost, I would be remiss if I didn't bring it up here with this conversation, because I bring it up almost every chance I get to, is a Neil Postman lecture from 1998 that was titled What We Need to Know About Technological Change. And so it was just this broad, it was a very well sort of laid out, but essentially that with all technological change comes these different ideas. So the technological trade-offs, right? This sort of like Faustian bargain, if you will, that everything comes with amazing benefits, but also disadvantages or trade-offs that were, you know, you could easily look at that as the trade-off of what it can do for us on a productivity side or in our individual lifespan or creativity, and the trade-off being right now perhaps the environmental energy consumption costs and things like that. There's winners and losers, right? There's people who benefit and there's people who suffer from it. I think one of the big pieces that has always stood out for me is that these changes are ecological, not additive. So once these things are,
and you got to say what you mean by that.
Yeah, so that once these sort of technological changes are into the environment, it's not merely adding something new, that it becomes so ingrained you cannot extract it any longer.
That's right. They're becoming integral to the environment. They become part of it, and how it operates or how it doesn't operate.
That's right. It's like it's an ingredient that gets baked into the bread as opposed to like toppings or something like that.
So you can't pull the yeast back out of a loaf of bread.
No, and likewise, you can't pull. I mean, I think in many ways, even already, I mean, I would feel that pull if it was like no longer, if I suddenly was like, I'm no longer going to use any generative AI tools. I'm like, you can't extract that any longer from my workflow.
It's embedded.
It's ecological. It's part of it. Right. But the other one, and I've said it on other podcasts, I'll say it here again, is this mythic status. And that's where I always draw from this idea of mythic status. But to me, and I think that relates to the comment you had made about the dangers of the loss of why we're doing what we're doing.
Yes.
Is this idea of something becoming a mythic status, meaning that over time, essentially, that these technologies are perceived as inevitable or natural, which leads to people stopping the critical examination. Right. You stop questioning or in any way testing its value, or even undermining. Should it be there? Is it smarter than us?
Because the assumption is it should be there.
It should be there.
Yep.
It is there.
Yep.
And so, and for me, one of the things that I tend to bring up when we talk about it, again, no surprise, big proponent of always paying very close attention to those unintended consequences, right? Yep. Is this threat of when something becomes mythic, though, like when people will pose that existential question of, well, aren't you worried that AI is going to take over and do? I'm like, no, but a human who mistrusts what data or decision making can be sort of done through AI, I worry about that.
Right.
That I worry about the mythic implication that someone would take something and no longer question it, no longer question the accuracy or the value, and then make real human decisions based on this mythic idea of a technology.
And so actually that comes back to a point, and I want to pull us back at some point to thinking machines where we started, because I think all this plays into it. But one of my big concerns around AI, which actually ties into this sort of idea of a mythic technology that everybody assumes that we have to develop, is the short-term consequences. So you could have AI systems that don't think at all. They're not self-aware. They're just machines, but they are incredibly powerful machines that we have succeeded decision-making to. So these machines now decide everything for us. They decide everything around supply chains, so how food gets into the grocery store, how water gets into our faucets, how energy gets into our homes. They decide how transportation systems work. They decide how decision-making works in judiciary systems and government. And they do this in a way that we, fundamentally don't understand. We just rely on because it seems to work.
Yep.
But they also do it in a way where if something stops working or there's a bug in the system that leads to something weird happening, we have lost all our defenses to deal with it.
Yeah.
And I think that is deeply plausible, even with the AI systems we're developing at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then you extend that to sort of what happens when these things can think, and it gets really weird.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's exactly it, right? This idea of that the blind acceptance of something, and I think that fuels. And again, coming back to the OpenAI, Sam Altman released a blog post, or depending on how you read it, a manifesto about how it's, and it points to this piece, which I think is very dangerous, which is, again, this tension is, I'm like, I am a heavy user of OpenAI's tools, yet feel this tension when you read things like, it's going to solve, don't worry about it.
Yep.
Give us what is he asking for? $7 trillion?
I can't remember, but it's going to fix climate. It's going to solve physics. I didn't even know that physics.
Did you know you could solve it?
Right. Yes.
But it creates this, and this is again where I come back and have these points of conflict, is that narrative is in some ways propelling this illusion of AI progress is inevitable. Right? Yes. That you don't worry about it. Don't worry about the near-term issues, even the long-term issues. Just, if you just trust me, give me the trillions of dollars, I will build a techno-utopia that solves the world problems,
everything.
right?
Yes. So I've got to ask you, and this comes back both to the status of OpenAI and thinking machines. So number one, would you trust a for-profit to fix everything?
No.
And secondly, would you trust a for-profit to create conscious machines that they claim are going to fix everything?
Yeah.
What could possibly go wrong with that?
My gut says no. Right. I mean, it's almost like a knee-jerk reaction. And to me, I think part of my friction, my internal turmoil with OpenAI is when, originally under its original flagship of this nonprofit that used a profit center to be able to, because hey, people need to get paid.
Right. You got to have money.
And we've seen compute power is incredibly expensive. That aligned with much more of this acceptance of it's for good.
Yes.
As it becomes a pure profit, and as someone, Sam Altman, he's not a technologist himself necessarily, but he is a promoter, and he is someone who's good at raising money. And I worry, I don't see the tech for good and raising money in the same line, and then that causes internal conflict.
Yep.
I don't know.
So what could be different here? So I'm going to push you to imagine a scenario where, let's say that thinking machines are something that we would like to build. We can sort of hypothesize about them fixing everything. I don't think they will, but they will be pretty cool, and they will disrupt the world in ways that I think could be positively transformative. And it's going to take a heck of a lot of money and a heck of a lot of resources to do that. So there's got to be money somewhere. I certainly wouldn't expect the government using taxpayer dollars to do that.
Yeah.
How do we achieve this if it's not a for-profit headed up via a visionary who can raise lots of money?
Yeah. Well, here's the rub of it is the money is going to be needed one way or another.
Right. Yep.
Right. What I would like to, so if I can build my own scenario, right?
Yes.
Would be sort of the reclaiming of where a lot of the research is taking place through public high institutions of higher education or public nonprofit institutions.
Yep. You mean like a university, for
instance? Like a university.
Yeah. And paying people like me and you. No, I'm sure that's not where you're going.
Well, it wouldn't hurt. Some of it, Sean's got bills too. I could use some of that trillions of dollars. But the thing that worries me about that alignment of a for-profit company being the pioneer of pushing these things is that mixed motive of what is the actual goal, because with that also comes a lack of transparency, because it becomes your secret recipe, your secret sauce.
That's
it becomes your value to a market. And we've seen, especially in the United States, for example, the market is always hungry for, it doesn't care what you did, it's what's next. What have you done for me lately? It's all about speculation, which you can feel when you read some of these things. We're going here, we're going there. So for me, one of the things that I would love to see, and I think, we can go back, it was about 2016-ish. I'm just going to throw that date out there, where you can see this big sort of pivot between research-based hired, institutions and private companies being the forefront of where those advancements were coming out of, right? And if we were able to reclaim, the reason I think that's so important to build a long trajectory success for these types of thinking machines, right, is in an environment that would promote openness and transparency.
Right. Yes.
Right. That things, as researchers, we're held to these codes of ethics around our research, which is not the same in private sector. I mean, maybe at an individual level, but certainly at an organizational level, those can go right out the window.
Right. Yes.
I mean, even with the original release of something like ChatGPT 3 point whatever, if that had come out of like a university, we would have to do IRBs and we would have to make sure that institutional review boards that basically review and approve the ethical consideration of a research study and making sure that no one gets harmed.
So there are checks and balances.
There's checks and balances.
Though actually, even on that, I'm going back to an earlier part of the conversation talking about superheroes trying to sort of maintain the status quo. Is there a danger of institutional practices being the superhero here that is trying to maintain the status quo? And maybe that is not what's needed if we want to build something that is transformative. And I'm sorry, I'm just riffing off what you were saying. So I think you're right. There's got to be some sort of coalition here where you have the not-for-profit, for public good, for public value growth side of things, alongside organizations that can move fast and build things fast. But I also wonder whether on the public side, we need to reevaluate how we do this. So how we work out what our core values are. And a lot of that is really doing stuff in a transparent way for the public good, but doing that, innovating in such a way that we don't create barriers to success there by saying that the stuff that worked 20 years ago should work now.
Yeah. No, I think that's a great observation too, because I think there's a reason that sort of flip happened in 2016-ish, right? Is that it was too slow. It was too slow. There wasn't enough money. Kind of a lot of those elements. I don't know how we get there. I mean, I think this is the challenge too, because then you start talking about policy and regulation, and
I know it gets bogged down.
Oh my gosh, I've written some of these policies.
Had a version of mental fog where everything just becomes too difficult.
But I think what would be, I think, tremendous, and would, I think, in many ways also sort of relieve a lot of people who are very concerned about privacy concerns, about these issues, is if the central technology of these is sort of overseen by open and transparent mechanisms, but then allowing for those commercial entities to use that to then develop products and commercialization opportunities and things like that.
So you have those partnerships. And this is where I strongly believe that certainly from public institutions, there should be respected thought leadership that is asking the tough questions. So you brought up privacy. There's also bias. There's also unintended consequences. There's how do you reach consensus in society as to what is appropriate, what we want, what we don't want. These are all really difficult, tough questions that a company probably doesn't want to ask.
Doesn't want to answer,
because it completely goes against the grain with their investors. So you've got to have somebody that is asking these questions, doing it in an independent and a serious way without an underlying agenda. But doing it in a way that actually has impact and it resonates and it is seen with respect. I think there is a profound role there. I would say for public universities, because I'm sitting in one, but I think there are other iterations of that. But there have got to be organizations that aren't in this just to ask how fast we can go and how can we support companies going as fast as possible, or even how we can make money from this. There should be organizations that are asking the really difficult questions, not to stop things, but to make sure we do things right.
Absolutely. I 100% agree with that, because you can't ask somebody who has an equity stake in the thing that is progressing to be like, wait a minute, should you be doing? And that, I think that's exactly it, because, again, I'll invoke the mythic genie again, but that's part of the problem, though, is like without that ability to ask those difficult questions of not with the intent of stopping something, but to go, wait a minute, if we go down this pathway, we can clearly see unintended consequences coming true. There's a very high probability of some risks A through Z that could be identified. And if you have a financial stake in that, you're much less likely, even at the individual level, to just go, well, but then that's, because you're putting that pressure on someone who is internal to it.
Right.
But that creates this issue of societally letting these things become unstoppable.
Right.
That there's no mechanism, because at some point, it becomes too large. The ball rolling downhill gets so big that the momentum is almost impossible to stop.
And this is the paradox of advanced technology transitions, that we're at a point, actually, I don't think you can stop these innovations. You can steer them, but how do you steer them within a society which is so complex that once something's got momentum, it is very, very hard to control it?
Yeah. And the only thing I would add to that is the complexity gets even deeper when you think that sort of technological change is being driven by a global north.
Right.
You mentioned the bias and the issues, right?
Yep.
But there also is this sort of like steamrolling effect of these things, because they're released not just to us, they're released to the world.
That's right. Yes.
And so also thinking about what languages, what cultures, what
You've got
ways
to have that
of life
global perspective.
they get trampled on these.
It's almost you need the counterbalance.
Yeah, you do.
Not to stop things, but to actually make sure that you've got balance within the system.
We need to invent a machine.
Right. The counterbalance machine.
We need to invent. This is where it all goes wrong. This is where we become villains. We need a new machine.
Well, actually, I think we need a thinking machine that's going to fix the problem.
That's right.
So
it'll solve itself.
Back to that idea of thinking machines. So I've no idea whether this is possible, but let's assume that it is possible. As a society, how do we approach this? Do we have conversations around whether we should or shouldn't? Or do we have conversations around who is actually responsible for spearheading this? Should it be just in the private sector? What role should the public sector play in actually building machines that have the ability to think? And where does this take us? Who should be part of this conversation, especially when most people are way too busy to be part of any sort of conversation?
Yeah, it's wild.
Yeah,
it's wild. And but I mean, I do think this is one of those conversations. And then, I mean, again, coming back, not to be self-serving, but I will. That's part of the reason why we started this podcast.
Right.
is to bring that conversation
I think so,
to
yes.
people who have never thought about their role in that conversation.
Yes. Yep.
Because that is an incredible, I mean, it will become an incredibly prescient conversation, because it's going to I mean, we've got an election here in the US coming up. But I can easily foresee in the near future, even starting to cast ballots based on people's position on how they plan to regulate, modify, or in any way from local, state, federal levels, and how they want to approach these types of technologies and how you cast your votes. So, I mean, even from that perspective, I think who needs to be involved in that table? I mean, in that conversation.
I know, yes.
I mean, everyone, but how do we do that exactly?
So I'm just thinking through this and thinking about the big issues at the moment. And of course, the big issues in the US we're facing have been around for a while.
Yeah.
It's looking at abortion. It's looking at energy access and use. It's looking at the economy and inflation and cost of living.
Yep.
But actually, you look at that energy one with the tension between, do you mine non-renewables to stimulate the
fossil
economy,
fuels.
or do you rely on renewables? That's getting mighty close to a major political issue around, do you invest in new technologies like AI or don't you? So I think it's entirely conceivable that elections could be won or lost in the future on what people think about AI. Yes, what their positions are, what their understanding is, what their understanding of how it impacts their lives is.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's, the hope that I have around these conversations is that even if people don't feel like they're at a position to have like a very strong position on I'm for this or we should all start thinking about it.
Right.
And these conversations need to start happening at the dinner table, at the pub, at the wherever. Is so that because I feel like, again, there's this issue of if we don't inspire people to engage in these conversations, they'll sit out until it's almost too late.
Right. Or they'll just absorb what other people tell them is the right way to think.
Yeah. And I think that's that danger of not participating in that.
Yep.
So we need a superhero to do that one.
Or a super villain, according to your theory. Yes.
I don't know. Maybe, I guess who's a hero and who's a villain is all perspective.
That feels like something for another podcast. So we came so far from asking whether thinking machines are possible, but actually I think it's entirely relevant to this conversation around how we think about technology in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. And how do we get there? And that's, we'll maybe we should just leave it that is like, what do you think? Looking at our audience, right?
Assuming that you're a thinking thing, machine or otherwise.
Yeah.
Yep.
And I'll end with one last. I can't let it go. I'll end with one last thing. And this is I forget where I read this. I think it was a park ranger or something. And one of the questions was asking about just whether or not people would be able to understand certain elements. And the quote was something. It was around bears. And because there's a bear box, for example, you go camping, you lock your stuff in there so a bear doesn't come and tear your tent apart or whatever. And it was like, well, can't we invent better bear, containment things? And the response was the overlap between not very smart humans and very clever bears is so great that it's a very difficult challenge to solve.
Right. Okay, yes, which tells you oodles about how we think about machines and what they might think about us at one point.
That's it. Great. Excellent. Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Andrew. This has been another fantastic conversation. And we look forward to seeing everyone else on the next episode of Modem Futura.
Thanks, Sean, my thinking partner, Sean.
Demodulating signal.
Modem Futura is a production of the Future of Being Human initiative at Arizona State University. Be sure to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows. To learn more about the Future of Being Human initiative and all of our other projects, please visit us on the web at futureofbeinghuman.asu.edu.
End transmission.